Okay, I'm going to take off from what Dr. Massanen has just said and talk about some other specific military occupations and some particular connections that exposures in those occupations have had with bladder cancer. I'm trying to forward the slide, and I guess it's not working, so I will ask Stephanie to give me the next slide.
It should be working now. You want to try?
I'm hitting return, I'm hitting forward. None of it seems to move the slide. Okay, there we go. In fact, we might have gone one slide too many. No, sorry. This is the three things that I would propose to talk about in the next 10 or 15 minutes. First is Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and the exposures that veterans there had, or servicemen there had, while stationed at Camp Lejeune and were drinking contaminated water contaminated with two chemical solvents that have been associated with bladder cancer. And then the next example I'll give is burn pit exposures, and those are in Iraq and Afghanistan primarily. There were some burn pit exposures in the first Gulf War in 1991, but we'll, for this presentation, limit the discussion to the Iraq and Afghanistan burn pits and what's the status of follow-up of veterans exposed to those and what might come down in the future. And then third, I'm going to use a kind of parallel example of the World Trade Center first responders who were exposed after the buildings came down and what they called the pile, working on the debris pile. Some of the same exposures occurred to the first responders in that category as had occurred previously in burn pit, soldiers who were exposed to burn pits in Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's some overlap there between the exposures and the likely connection to bladder cancer. So next slide. So first, a little more about Camp Lejeune. As it says, it's the home of expeditionary forces in readiness, and this is in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which is sort of near the South Carolina, North Carolina border. And it's the East Coast Training Center for the majority of Marines. And there is also a Navy air base on the Camp Lejeune space, but it's primarily a training site for Marines. There's an equivalent site in the West Coast. It's in Camp Pendleton in California. So as it turns out, there's a easy comparison to make from an epidemiologic point of view between what diseases the Camp Lejeune veterans had compared to the Camp Pendleton veterans, because they're all Marines and they all had to go through the same induction process. They all are basically healthy men to get into the Marine service, but then there's some differences in the disease patterns that occurred many years after based on where people were based and where people got their training. I should say Camp Lejeune is both a training site and it's a residence for people who do the training, who actually live on Camp Lejeune. So there's, as you'll see, there'll be some comparisons of both those veterans that went through and those who were just working there. Next slide. So the Camp Lejeune drinking water contamination, as I mentioned, was primarily due to two chemicals that were in the drinking water for different parts of the base. The base is about, it's like a small city. There are 40,000 people living there at one time or another, at any one time, actually. And many of them are there just for short periods during their training. But they have to get their uniforms cleaned. And if they're families and family members, they may go to a commercial dry cleaning facility that was located literally across the street from Camp Lejeune. So the dry cleaning solvent called perchloroethylene that was detected in the drinking water was from both sources. It was both from dry cleaning that occurred on the base for the military uniforms and dry cleaning especially that occurred off base and then contaminated the groundwater and made its way into the wells that served especially the family housing that were closest to that part of Camp Lejeune. And then the second important exposure was a chemical called trichloroethylene Trichloroethylene is a degreasing solvent that is used to take, say, for example, um, grease off of parts that have been machined on a lathe, or it's sometimes used to remove solvent to remove grease in the process of repairing vehicles, and in this case, primarily military vehicles. And that also was disposed of in a careless way, such that it got into groundwater on the base and then dissolved and went through the surfaces, went through the soil into the area that there were drinking water wells drawing water up from underground. There was additional exposure to benzene from a different source, but I'm going to talk primarily because of the interest in bladder cancer with these two solvents, perchloroethylene and trichloroethylene. Incidentally, the trichloroethylene drinking water standard for currently is 5 parts per billion. But when it was first discovered in the Camp Lejeune drinking water in the early 1980s, at least one source of the finished water was measured at 1,400 parts per billion. So it was dramatically increased. The trichloroethylene especially was dramatically increased over what would be allowed in a drinking water supply currently. Next slide. Because the Marines themselves became aware of this pollution, they really actually led the charge, so to speak, for some health studies. There were Marines who were based at Camp Lejeune who were employed by the military to do training, and then there were family members and family members of Marines who were located on the base, and then there were veterans who were just got their training at Camp Lejeune who formed a advocacy group, and they actually set up their own website called The Few, the Proud, the Forgotten, in which they asked for people who had been based or had gone through Camp Lejeune to report voluntarily what their health problems were. And they started collecting this in their own website. I think it's still available if anybody wanted to see that. But as a result of that, there was pressure on the Centers for Disease Control and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry to look into what were the health consequences of these exposures that were identified in the early 1980s and then became part of a federal designation of Camp Lejeune as a Superfund site in the 1990s. The veterans took that information, pressured CDC, pressured the elected officials from the state of North Carolina, the Congress people and the senators to do something to find out what had happened to the people who were exposed to this contaminated water. And so there had been a series of health studies that were done. There's a long story about how these health studies are done, but basically the roster of veterans who were based or went through Camp Lejeune was available in a federal database. I think it's called Defense Manpower Data Center, that could be linked to the National Death Index, which is maintained by the National Center for Health Statistics. And that electronic linkage allowed a comparison of how many veterans who were associated or had lived at Camp Lejeune had died and what they had died of, and then a comparison to those veterans who went through Camp Pendleton in California and how many of those had died and what they had died of. This is a huge study. It was hundreds of thousands of veterans combining the two bases, Camp Lejeune and Camp Pendleton. And approximately 500,000 people, 500,000 veterans had gone through Camp Lejeune, not all of whom could be identified on these databases because of the limitations of the years for which they were available, but it still allowed a so-called follow-up study of hundreds of thousands of veterans in the two bases. And what they found was that comparing Camp Lejeune to Camp Pendleton, there was an overall statistically significant increase in deaths due to cancer. That was also, there were some specific subtypes of cancer that were also elevated, but which didn't reach the level of what's sometimes called statistical significance. So the main finding was the increase in deaths overall. There was also a study of children who were born while their parents were living on Camp Lejeune. And there, that study followed up over 1,000 children that had been born on Camp Lejeune and found increased birth defects, especially what's called neural tube defects, which include spina bifida, and blood cancers, leukemia and lymphoma primarily, in children who were born on Camp Lejeune compared to what would be expected in children elsewhere. And that was published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And then they did a third study. There are additional studies underway, but the third study that's been published already has to do with civilians who worked on Camp Lejeune but lived nearby in North Carolina. And they found in that group that there was increased deaths due to kidney cancer in the Camp Lejeune civilian employees, again, compared to civilian employees in Camp Pendleton. So those findings are already in the published peer-reviewed literature, and I think now we can look at the next slide. They led to legislation that was passed in 2012, and it was called the Janie Ensminger Act. Janie Ensminger was the daughter of a Marine who was based at Camp Lejeune. He was a sergeant, and he trained Marines that were coming through the base for their training, in addition to other jobs that he had prior to that. But he was the father of as he puts it, a young girl who was conceived, born, got leukemia, and died while living on Camp Lejeune. And so the act that was passed by Congress was basically to take recognition of that fact that Jerry Ensminger's daughter had, lost her life from the apparent exposures to chemical contaminants that she had while she was living there. And the act actually extends compensation for veterans and their families who were exposed during the years 1953 to 1987. And those are the years for which contaminated drinking water had been documented up to the time of these studies. So anybody who was exposed during those years then on Camp Lejeune had a presumptive cause of their disease for 15 different types of disease because of their exposure to contaminated drinking water. In other words, that it was assumed that because they were there and they were exposed, these diseases that are linked to the chemicals, and especially, as I said, the solvents trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, they didn't have to prove that their exposure was due to some length of time that they lived there or some particular job that they had while they lived there, or their family member had some specific exposure. All of it was assumed to be because of living there and having drunk the water. It's what's called a presumptive compensation scheme, which makes it much more automatic for the veterans and their families. And that current list of presumptive diseases includes bladder cancer, kidney cancer, and 13 other diseases that in the literature have been linked to those exposures to those solvents. The evidence for bladder cancer was not so much from the studies of deaths due to the Camp Lejeune veterans as what's in the literature from, say, for example, workers exposed due to perchloroethylene due to their employment in dry cleaning. Kidney cancer did show up especially in the civilian employees at Camp Lejeune, and it's shown up in many other studies of people exposed at work, primarily to trichloroethylene. So that's the current list, and it does include bladder cancer because of, as I said, the connection to solvents that were found in the drinking water at Camp Lejeune. The work is still going on. There's an ongoing cancer incidence study that will look at not just the deaths due to cancer, but diagnoses of cancers. That's a much larger number. A lot more people get diagnosed with cancer than actually die of it. And so that study will take another few years to complete. Maybe we can now switch to the next slide.